The AZ-104 exam, which is a certification exam for Microsoft Azure administrators, is designed to test the skills and knowledge required to manage, monitor, and maintain Azure solutions. The exam is aimed at assessing the candidate's proficiency in managing Azure resources, configuring and managing virtual networks, implementing and managing storage solutions, securing identities, managing serverless computing, and ensuring business continuity. Share some Microsoft AZ-104 exam questions here. 1. You have an Azure subscription that contains a storage account named Storage1. The Storage1 account contains a file share named Share1. The subscription is linked to a hybrid Azure Active Directory, Azure AD, tenant that contains a security group named Group1. You need to grant Group1 the storage file data SMB share elevated contributor role for Share1. What should you do first? A. Enable Active Directory domain service, ADS, authentication for Storage1. B. Grant share level permissions by using File Explorer. C. Mount Share1 by using File Explorer. D. Create a private endpoint. 2. You have an Azure App Services web app named App1. You plan to deploy App1 by using Web Deploy. You need to ensure that the developers of App1 can use their Azure Active Directory, Azure AD, credentials to deploy content to App1. The solution must use the principle of least privilege. What should you do? A. Configure app-level credentials for FTPs. B. Assign the website contributor role to the developers. C. Assign the owner role to the developers. D. Configure user-level credentials for FTPs. 3. You have 5 Azure virtual machines that run Windows Server 2016. The virtual machines are configured as web servers. You have an Azure load balancer named LB1 that provides load balancing services for the virtual machines. You need to ensure that visitors are serviced by the same web server for each request. What should you configure? A. Session persistence to none. B. Floating IP, direct server return, to disabled. C. A health probe. D. Session persistence to client IP. 4. You plan to deploy route-based site-to-site VPN connections between several on-premises locations and an Azure virtual network. Which tunneling protocol should you use? A. L2TP B. IKEv2 C. PPTP D. IKEv1. 5. You have 3 offices and an Azure subscription that contains an Azure Active Directory, Azure AD tenant. You need to grant user management permissions to a local administrator in each office. What should you use? A. Azure AD roles. B. Administrative units. C. Access packages in Azure AD entitlement management. D. Azure roles. 6. You have an Azure Active Directory, Azure AD tenant. You plan to delete multiple users by using bulk delete in the Azure Active Directory Admin Center. You need to create and upload a file for the bulk delete. Which user attributes should you include in the file? A. The user principal name and usage location of each user only. B. The user principal name of each user only. C. The display name of each user only. D. The display name and usage location of each user only. E. The display name and user principal name of each user only. 7. You have a registered DNS domain named contoso.com. You create a public Azure DNS zone named contoso.com. You need to ensure that records created in the contoso.com zone are resolvable from the Internet. What should you do? A. Create NS records in contoso.com. B. Modify the SOA record in the DNS domain registrar. C. Create the SOA record in contoso.com. D. Modify the NS records in the DNS domain registrar. 8. You have an Azure subscription that contains two virtual machines named VM1 and VM2. You create an Azure load balancer. You plan to create a load balancing rule that will load balance HTTPS traffic between VM1 and VM2. Which two additional load balance resources should you create before you can create the load balancing rule? Each correct answer presents part of the solution model. Each correct selection 5 worth 1 point. A front-end IP address. B. A backend pool. C. A health probe. D. An inbound NAT rule. E. A virtual network. 9. You have an Azure subscription. You are deploying an Azure KubeMeets service AKS cluster that will contain multiple pods. The pods will use Kubernetes networking. You need to restrict network traffic between the pods. What should you configure on the AKS cluster? A. Pod security policies. B. The Calico network policy. C. An application security group. D. The Azure network policy. 10. You have an Azure web app named App1. You need to monitor the availability of App1 by using a multi-step web test. What should you use in Azure Monitor? A. Azure Application Insights. B. The Diagnostic settings. C. Metrics. D. Azure Service Health.